So good morning, my name's Kelly Court. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the Senior Advisor for the Australian Council of Social Service. Welcome to the first in a series of workshops that ACOSS is hosting this week to build the capacity of the community sector to engage and advocate for more rapid, fair and just action on climate change. So before I go any further, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodians of the country in which I usually work, which is the Yagara and the Turrbal people. I recognise the right for all First Peoples around the country to self-determination and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. There are too many of us to go into introductions in such a large group this morning, but I would encourage you to put your name and organisation that you're from in the Zoom name place area, which I can see lots of people have already done. But it might also be nice to, in the chat, just introduce yourself and also put the name of the Indigenous place that you're currently working and residing. And I'm assuming for a lot of people that's same place and possibly in your bedroom or lounge room or study at the moment. And actually, having mentioned that, I just want to acknowledge the very difficult challenge that a lot of people are experiencing at the moment with the acceleration of the pandemic, and just hope that everyone is treating themselves kindly, and yes, and hope that you stay healthy and safe. So in this session today, you'll learn more about the science of climate change and how it interacts with social justice, and learn how to talk about climate change in an effective and accessible way. Experts on climate change science and communication will share how to speak to different audiences about the current and future impacts of climate change and the costs of inaction. So this morning you'll hear from three wonderful speakers: Dr. Rebecca Huntley, one of Australia's foremost researchers on social trends, Dr. Susie Maloney, who is the Executive Director of the Centre for Just Places at Jesuit Social Service, and Professor Leslie Hughes, who will be joining us a little bit later. She's actually lecturing at the moment, so she'll join us in about half an hour. So she's an eminent climate scientist who's participated in a number of the intergovernmental panel on climate change. After the presentation, we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&As with the audience. So put your questions in the chat during the presentations. I'll try and keep an eye on them, and then I'll call on you during the Q&A to ask the question, or you can just put the hand up using the hand up function as well, and we can come to you then. We'll all then spend a little bit time in a breakout group to discuss how you can apply the information and various communications frameworks you learned today in your organisation. So that'll be a good opportunity to start thinking about how to apply it, and then we'll come back to the larger group, share some of that learnings. And then we have a little activity we want to do towards the end to show a little bit of solidarity and support for the need for rapid, fair and just climate action. So if you can, please have an A4 piece of paper handy and a marker ready to have something legible to write on for the camera right at the end of the session. That would be great. Don't worry if you don't have it, but if you can, that would be fantastic. And I did want to say that Tim Lasordo from Democracy for Colour was going to be your chair for today, but unfortunately he's come down with the flu and has lost his voice over the weekend. So you will have my dulcet tones as chair for the rest of the session. And hopefully Rebecca, who seems to have a bit of a cough, will be able to survive the session as well. Okay, so let's get started. So I would like to warmly welcome Dr. Rebecca Huntley, who's one of, as I said, Australia's foremost researchers on social trends. She has led research at Essential Media and Vox Populi, part of the Circa Research Group, before starting her own research and consulting business. She works closely with the Sunrise Movement on the Climate Compass project, as well as with many other climate and environment NGOs. She's the author of numerous books, including How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to you now, Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm really hoping that I'll be absolutely fine as I speak. I just don't want to cough all the way through everybody else's presentations. Can everyone see that? Great, excellent.
Yes.
So I'm just going to start my timer because I don't want to go over time as well. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak to such a diverse and important group of people about just some kind of almost first principles around communicating to different audiences around climate and the current environment. So let me go to the first thing that I always want to start when I talk about this, which is that it's actually hard. Talking about climate change may in fact be harder than talking about sex, politics, and religion. and I even struggle to talk about it. In fact, the closer somebody is to me, the harder it is to talk to them about it. That being, and so why is that the case? So if you feel either in your own work within your own organisation or leading or advocating the importance of talking about climate within your own organisation, or even how you are just generally in the world in your in the networks that you have of influence, if you struggle, then you're not alone. What are the barriers to talking about climate change, whether that be in your professional or personal life? Well, I suppose the first barrier here is that climate change, the discussion around climate change has always been posited as highly technical, as something that either scientists get the have the privilege to talk about, or policy gurus or politicians. So we have this sense that climate change requires an enormous amount of technical and scientific knowledge to have the permission to talk about. In the Climate Compass, which I'll show you a bit later, we even find that people who know quite a lot about climate change, so their scientific literacy is pretty good, even they feel that talking about climate change, they don't know enough. They're not across the facts and the information. And the other, of course, so there's a technical barrier to us talking about it, but there's also a technical barrier for engagement in it. So when we look at audiences that perhaps are less focused on climate change, less concerned about it, when you ask them, you know, when you hear and read about climate change, how do you feel? And they often say they kind of feel like they are flummoxed or uncertain, or to some extent as well, they probably feel uneducated and dumb. And so like, I don't understand what the difference is between 1.5 and 2%, you know, warming, and why that should be significant. So the first barrier, I think, both to us talking about it and generally different audiences engaging with it, is technical. The second barrier is political. So and this is not uniform. Across the world, there has been far more political, climate change hasn't been mired in the politics of partisanism or the culture wars, but in Australia and the United States, as well as a few other countries, but we stand out in that respect. Climate change is positioned as a highly political, highly partisan issue. And when we look a bit later at Climate Compass, we'll see that, in fact, one of the big determinants of whether you take climate change seriously or whether you're worried about it is your how you vote, your political, where you sit on the political spectrum. Now, of course, that's a barrier as well, both for people talking about climate change, for organisations, particularly not just in the community sector, but elsewhere, engaging with it, as well as audiences engaging with it. One of the things that's really fascinating when we look at some of the audience work around climate is even people who are really concerned about climate, even really alarmed about it, when we ask them what are the barriers to you talking about it or acting on it, either in your personal life or your professional life within the organisations where you're employed, they say, I don't want to be seen as a politically pushy person. So there is this kind of reticence around talking around climate change because it looks like maybe you're kind of trying to push a political agenda on people. Obviously, there's real difficulties for organisations where it's absolutely critical that they remain politically neutral in the work that they do, or don't seem to be pushing a particular partisan agenda, that it's very kind of, they're nervous around how they might talk about climate change in a way that doesn't seem to trigger partisan, conflict. And of course, externally, when we look at different audiences and how they respond to climate, again, they think that when climate change is brought up, it's akin to raising the most tricky and difficult political issues. They associate it with kind of extreme partisanism on social media, or people yelling at each other in question time. And most people don't really want to, most people are conflict averse, understandably. They don't really want to open that, Pandora's box, and so they avoid it as well. A big challenge for us in Australia and in places like the United States is to find ways to depoliticise, departisanise climate change. And that's why highlighting voices that are politically unaligned or conservative voices on climate is now and has been, a bit of a focus of the climate movement more broadly, and an absolutely urgent need to be able to do that. Of course, the other critical barrier is that it's overwhelming. Both the scale of it, when you engage even a little bit in the science, feels overwhelming, and the scale of the challenge in front of us is overwhelming. I think more so in Australia than perhaps other countries, and that's because there is, and certainly over the last 18 months, we found in the research, an emerging sense that we are behind the 8 ball, mainly because of what's happened at the federal political level, frankly, on both sides of politics. And so people feel like we have to put an enormous amount of effort just to play catch up rather than to even get in front of this issue. It's overwhelming at the moment because of COVID as well. I mean, interestingly, last year, we found people's interest in climate and their desire to act on climate solutions remained reasonably strong in the face of COVID, perhaps because it wasn't, we felt that it didn't affect us quite as badly as it did for the rest of the world. We might be going through a new phase where people feel like there's only so many crises we can handle at the moment. I don't know if that's the case, but I think interlocking environmental, social, and economic crises and talking about climate change within that context can be very difficult. I suppose the other, and in some ways this is the most fundamental barrier for audiences of all kinds, is that climate change, in particular acting on climate change, feels somewhat disconnected or remote from our everyday lives. So most people are just trying to get through their day, trying to, put a roof over their heads, educate their children, feed their children, keep their jobs. And sometimes climate change and acting on climate change feels like an issue that's remote, both in time and place, and something that people think that is important, want the government to do something, but when they think about, when you ask them a question, when you ask them whether they think climate action will help their day-to-day lives today, there's really only about 30% of the population that would agree with a statement like that. Most people push it out, and most people see a kind of a disconnect between climate impacts, change, and their own personal lives. And finally, and I delve a bit in my book around this, is around our complex psychological response to climate messages and climate change more broadly, is that for a lot of people, climate change doesn't feel like an immediate pressing crisis. In a sense, this is a point that's a kind of sub-point of this other disconnect, remote issue. If you think about COVID and why people recognise it's a crisis, is because you walk out your front door and people are wearing masks, and the government's talking about it, the media's everywhere talking about it, and that sends very kind of clear messages to us as social human beings, but also to our brain that we're in a crisis. The problem with climate change, of course, is unless you recognise very strongly the connections between extreme weather events and climate, unless you really have a kind of deep and intimate connection with climate effects, so whether you're a climate scientist or potentially whether you're somebody who works consistently with the land, but even then, it doesn't register as a crisis. It doesn't feel like a crisis. I mean, if it wasn't for COVID, I'd look out my window today in Sydney. It's a beautiful day. There's trees. Everything seems fine. And so the language of crisis and emergency is not something that necessarily works with all audiences. And even when there are signs of climate change bringing about crises today, whether that be extreme weather events or erosion or any of those other kinds of things, or even things like refugee crises and humanitarian crises sparked by things like climate effects, we don't register them as a crisis. And so again, it's that disconnect, remote threat that we feel we don't necessarily have to mobilise around today. So there are some of the barriers so significant. So again, if you find it hard to talk about climate change, there are reasons. But there is also some pretty well tried and true approaches to talking about it, and increasingly an interest in the community more broadly to find ways to talk about it. I think going back to my point about the making the connections between everybody's everyday lives and climate action, one of the most useful concepts that I came across, particularly in my social research, was this concept of objects of care. This is a piece of work coming out of some work done by some former social scientists working at the CSIRO, as well as Carmen Lawrence, who used to be a Labor Party, used to be a Labor politician, and they did some really interesting work around how you link people's the things that matter to people, this notion of objects of care, with climate change, and how that can bridge the psychological distance between self and climate change, which I mentioned before, that disconnect, that sense of it being remote. They did some really interesting psychological testing work that showed that if you can make that link, you can with people, but starting not so much with the science and climate change, but starting with the things that mattered to people, that they valued, then you could provoke stronger emotions, which would help promote action. So this is a notion, this is, guides us towards more effective climate communication that isn't necessarily science first, or isn't necessarily technical language first, or talking about IPCC reports or anything else. It starts with what matters to people. What are the things that people value? It means that you have to have a much stronger connection with what that audience of concern or that group of concern that you're working with, what they value, and then find effective ways to ladder up from that thing that matters to them to climate change. Or if for whatever reason climate change, in a sense, that language about climate change isn't going to be effective, action on climate change, which may have really important co-benefits. If you just indulge me for a moment, because I've got a bit of time, I had presenting some work that I did to the New South Wales, a group of parliamentarians in State Parliament, New South Wales. And one of the members who represents an area where what we would describe as a coal mining area in New South Wales, said to me after I presented, his hand shot up and he said to me, well, if I was going to invite you to my electorate to talk to people in my electorate about why climate change matters, I mean, what would you say to them? He was respectful but a little defensive. And I said, well, I wouldn't presume for a moment to go and lecture them about the science of climate change, because I'm a social scientist, not a climate scientist. But I would start a conversation about what really matters to that community. Where do they want that community to be in 5 or 10 or 15 years? What are the things that worry them? What are the things they want to protect? What are the things they fear that they're losing? And what are the things that they want to build? And we can find a way out of that conversation about their vision for their community today and the future, about how the role of renewable energy, or the role of more green space, or the role of jobs in a new energy economy. And so I think he was a bit surprised. He thought I was going to show them lots of charts of destruction and polar bears emaciated and all the rest of it. But really the conversation starts with what matters to those communities. And then, like I said, making that connection to climate action. As Kelly said, and as I mentioned, I'm involved in something called Climate Compass, which is an Australian audience segmentation. This is now about a year old. It's refreshed every year. It guides a lot of the research I do and a lot of the research that's being done broadly by the climate movement, but also by the renewable energy sector. I've worked with this segmentation with organisations, local councils, state government departments. And what it does is essentially identifies 7 different audiences based on how they respond to climate and how they feel about climate change. It's useful in that it kind of gives you a much more nuanced understanding of where the community sits rather than the usual surveys that many of you must have seen. 60% of people think climate change is an issue, or 71%, there's various things around like that. This segmentation, I can answer questions here and elsewhere about it, but this segmentation shows you both the opportunity and the challenge that faces us. The opportunity is that only 9% of the community are what we would describe as dismissive or denialists, or to some extent might be delayists on climate. So extremely hard to reach. All of these other audiences, like 91% of the community, can be reached, if not on climate, but on climate solutions, so issues like renewable energy. For the challenges in communicating with all of these audiences are different. The channel, the effective messengers, their other priorities in life. For some groups, their biggest concern are things like cost of living. For other groups, their biggest concern are things like health and education. So this is a kind of a bit of a, well, it's a compass, it's a kind of guide towards finding ways to talk to different audiences about what are essentially the same solutions in terms of what we need to do in relation to climate change, but very different. The more alarmed you are about climate, the more you respond effectively to language around things like climate emergency, climate crisis. You don't have to convince the alarmed and alert that the Black Summer bushfires were evidence of climate change in our world today. But you had to work a lot harder with cautious and disengaged groups on that question. They probably hadn't even thought about it, whereas you get real resistance from the doubtful around those kinds of extreme weather events. And so working with the compass and, looking at this and looking both at your organisations internally, but potentially to your external audiences as well, I'm sure to be really clear where they sit, where you sit, and how we foster conversations effectively across these audience segments, and how we kind of keep those audiences in mind when we think about the most effective climate communication. Just quickly, before one final slide that I want to take you through about evidence of why looking at audience is so important. I do want you to know that as organisations in the community services sector and that sector more broadly, you have permission to talk about climate change, whether that be internal or external. How you do it is another question, but you have permission. This is also from Climate Compass, where we ask people who should be doing more around climate change and climate action. Obviously, those parts of civil society and global society that have the greatest power or responsibility were seen to have the most, should be doing more. So businesses, the Australian government. But it didn't mean that local community organisations, local councils, employers, they also thought that they had a role to play. Having done 20 years of research on community attitudes to who should be doing more about social problems, I can tell you that this has shifted quite a lot over that period of time. It might be because people realise that the complexity of the issue around climate change requires everybody to be playing a role, the scale of the problem and the fact that we have a lot of catch up to do, a bit recognising that the Australian federal government perhaps has lagged behind, and that's a uniform feeling across all the focus groups escalating over the last 2 years. But if you're an organisation where you see that climate change impacts are going to make your role harder and the communities that you support their lives harder, you have the permission to talk about climate change. Like I said, it's just how you do it in the most effective way with the most effective language with the most effective messengers, I think is really critical. And then just finally, what I wanted to do is give you a little bit of an example. This is from some research I did for an NGO, where I tested a whole range of messages with those audiences that I showed you before on the compass. And we put in front of them a statement: we have only 10 years to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change. This was actually before the recent IPCC report. So this is just this is last year that I did this. So it's a question of time span there, and the word catastrophic, and a message around urgency. All right. We presented this to different audiences. You can see there from that comment from somebody who would very much fall into the alarmed category, as they saw that climate change was making an impact on their lives today. So no need to, it was not a remote issue, it was not a disconnected issue, and a real sense that of anger that Australia should be doing more. So a sense of anger, frustration, that tends to be the kind of most, an occasional little smattering of despair, kind of sadness is how generally alarmed people respond emotionally to climate change. But there is this kind of sense of accepting the necessary notion of urgency and not pushing back on the 10-year, or not pushing back on the catastrophic there. Then you go to kind of somebody who would fall much more in the concerned or cautious group. And very much, again, when presented with something, a timeline like that, which is a completely reasonable timeline, in fact, probably a little bit generous if you actually immerse yourself in the science, really pushing back and saying this is something that is for our children and grandchildren, and also pushing back on what they see as, in a sense, what they call the repetitive language of climate change. And in the focus groups I do, people tend to say, oh, it sounds like a script, we've heard it all before. So there's a little bit of like water off a duck's back around the traditional climate change language and script, which worries me, because it's as true, that script is as true now, in fact, more than ever before. So we do have to mix it up. And there, of course, relevancy. So concerned and cautious, even though they accept the climate science, they love renewable energy, they want the government to do more, there's still more that we need to do to make those connections, make it feel relevant, say that this is something that both has an impact and a benefit to you today. Don't just push it out to lives of your grandchildren. And then finally, you've got there a response from the doubtful. So you get this real pushback on the idea that this is a catastrophic, real pushback on the idea that, you know, on what they call the greenies, alarmism from the greenies there, and this sense that, you know, and also the sense of like pushing back around personal responsibility around the question. That being said, for all of these audiences where a message like that didn't work, a message around urgency around renewable energy and the transition and the opportunity that Australia has to become a renewable energy superpower and the need to government to support that was uniformly supported by all those groups. So it wasn't that there was that the message of urgency around transition wouldn't work, but how that was framed for those different audiences worked in different ways. And in fact, the further you get away from the alarmed group, the narrower, the fewer messages, effective messages around climate action work. And in fact, with the doubtful, having done many, many, many focus groups with doubtful people in the Hunter Valley and, you know, regional Queensland and all those other places that you imagine that social researchers like me that do my work do, it's very hard to get them engaged with the climate science, but you can get them engaged with the opportunity Australia has to continue what is already, you know, a fast developing ability to embrace renewable energy in a way that has benefits for jobs, for energy independence, for cheaper energy for families of all kinds, and other things like that. So have I, 3 minutes over, I apologise, I'm going to stop. There we go.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was really, really helpful and very interesting. I especially liked the bit about the making connection. I think is really important, and we'll probably hear a little bit more about that from Susie, but it's also something that we'll talk about in the subsequent workshops on Tuesday and Wednesday, as well, as about how to make those connections and bring it to life. So thanks, Rebecca. Okay, so now I'd like to hand over to Susie Maloney, who's Executive Director of the Centre for Just Place at Jesuit Social Service. Susie was previously an Associate Professor in Sustainability and Urban Planning in the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies, and a member of the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT University. So over recent years, Susie has worked on a range of applied climate change research projects with local and state government and community sector organisations. She's one of the co-founders of the Climate Change Exchange, a not-for-profit that is committed to goals of justice, equity and ecological sustainability in working towards a climate resilient future. The Climate Change Exchange aims to build the capability of organisations to make evidence-informed decisions and take actions that target the drivers of risk and vulnerabilities. Thanks for joining us today, Susie, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks very much. I'll just share. Can everybody see?
Yeah, maybe if you can put it on presentation mode, that'd be lovely.
There we go.
Perfect, thank you.
All right, great. Thank you so much, ACOSS and the Better Futures Forum for inviting me to come along today, and thanks, Rebecca, for sort of framing a whole lot of challenging issues around how to communicate on climate change. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples on whose unceded lands I live and work. So I guess just quickly about the context from where I'm sitting within the Centre for Just Places, which is a relatively new initiative starting earlier this year. So we're focusing on enabling and supporting place-based approaches to addressing disadvantage and also building resilient, inclusive and regenerative communities. And ecological justice is something that Jesuit Social Services has been talking about now for over a decade in thinking about and working on how to embed that across all areas of their work. And this really does sit at the heart of the work we're doing at the centre. So through research, action and advocacy, we're collaborating and partnering with a whole range of different organisations and communities. So today I'm going to present on how we think and talk about climate change through the work we're doing in different places across Melbourne, focusing on building community resilience within and through the community services sector. So to provide a bit of context for this work, I just want to briefly touch on some key points and concepts that really do inform how we think and talk about climate change. First, I think a central point is that social justice and climate justice are inseparable. The IPCC in recent reports, in many recent reports, have been unequivocal about the fact that delaying emissions is going to greatly worsen not just climate change impacts, but climate injustices. And no doubt Leslie will draw attention to those facts after this presentation. But another key point is that, and it's been clearly recognised and it's often talked about in contexts like this, is that we do know that people who are socially, economically, culturally, politically, institutionally, and otherwise marginalised are especially vulnerable to climate change and also to some adaptation and mitigation responses. So we begin by centering the idea of social justice and climate justice as being inseparable. I think the second point that we talk about is and really galvanizing, you know, and it is galvanizing multiple sectors in thinking about climate change, is that it is also a serious health issue. And there are multiple direct and indirect ways in which climate change is impacting on human health and on ecological health. And here are just a list of some figures, facts and figures around the direct impact of climate change. We know that more Australians die from extreme heat than any other natural disaster. In the 2009 Melbourne heat wave, this led to 374 deaths. In 2014, the Melbourne heatwave saw a 5-fold increase in heat-related presentations. Jesuit Social Services works in the Northern Territory, and we're involved in a climate action coalition there. But just a figure from the Northern Territory in 2019, there was over 54 days of over 40 degrees, and 2/3 of those who presented to emergency department were homeless. Other figures around the bushfire smoke, and it also causing a whole range of health-related risks, including deaths. And then there are there's a whole number of indirect health risks that research is really, there's a lot more research now pointing to anxiety, depression, and also rates of violence against women during heat waves. So all of these issues really do drive home the point that climate change is a health risk, and this frames it more locally. We do get a lot of research that points to the global implications to communities around the world, but this really is just sort of bringing home the local impacts. I guess another point to just make here is about the way in which action on climate change is sort of framed, particularly in policy space, and it's framed around mitigation and adaptation. And here, I guess my emphasis is on adaptation, and I guess the point I just want to make is that both mitigation and adaptation are essential. And certainly the IPCC report this week really has driven home the urgency of action over the next 10 years on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. But today I'm sort of focusing more on the other side of the work that needs to be done, which is on adaptation. And I guess thinking about adaptation as really being a social change project, that it involves both technical and social actions, and the sorts of things that are talked about in adaptation cut across all sectors. So talking about using scarce water resources, adapting building codes, changing the way we're planning our cities, planning for heat waves and heat stress, and also disaster and emergency management. So there's a whole range of activities and actions that need to be done across the adaptation space. And I'm just sort of positioning what I'm talking about here in that particular context. Another point that I just want to make is really sort of challenging the idea that adaptation is a technical exercise. It's very much a social and a political
So Leslie is joining us today. She's a Distinguished Professor of Biology and Pro-Vice Chancellor in Research Integrity and Development at Macquarie University. Her principal research interest has been the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems. But Leslie, I feel like you're an expert on almost everything climate change now, including communications. Leslie's the former lead author in the IPCC's 4th and 5th assessments report, and a former federal climate commissioner, and now a councillor with the Climate Council of Australia. She's also a member of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists and a director of WWF Australia. So Leslie's going to run through some of the latest climate change and how to talk about the science of climate change. Thanks, Leslie.
Thanks, Kelly. Hello, everybody. I'll share my screen. And hope that I'm not beset with the same issues as poor Susie was. Look, I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because I was lecturing while Rebecca was giving most of her talk. So Rebecca, I'm sorry if I overlap with you at all. I probably will. I guess, like Rebecca, I'm very interested in climate change communication. I guess I come at it in a slightly different way, in that as a practicing scientist, I have over the last 10 to 15 years moved into climate change communication much more formally, though I don't have a background in social science or psychology. So I guess a lot of what I'm going to talk about is my own lived experience as a climate change communicator, rather than from the sort of angle that Rebecca's coming through, but I hope we complement each other. But if I repeat anything that Rebecca has said, I hope that's just reinforcing rather than annoying. So I want to firstly acknowledge the difficulties we have in talking about climate change, because most of us feel like this most of the time. And I've seen some comments in the chat that basically refer to this phenomenon, because on the one hand, climate scientists do a lot of talking about gloom and doom and disaster and catastrophe and all of the things that are going on, that as scientists, we are ingrained in telling it like it is. We have to be honest rather than sugarcoating. On the other hand, we know, and work such as what I think Rebecca's been talking about indicates that people can really shut down and get climate change fatigue if they hear too much of this. And really what they want to know is about all of the solutions and the hopeful things. So we walk this tightrope as climate change communicators all the time. How we balance depends on the audience. We don't always get it right, but I just want to acknowledge that this is a really difficult thing and we all grapple with it. So this is not going to be a climate change lecture, but I am going to touch on just a few of the things that's been happening. So atmospheric CO2 now nearly 50% up from pre-industrial levels. The IPCC report that came out last week said that this is higher than at any time in the last 2 million years. The key message from this is that humans have changed our environment. Extreme heat and heat waves, Susie mentioned some of these before she lost her sound, are increasing. This is the sort of the most impactful part of climate change. 2020 was globally the hottest year on record. The previous 7 years, the hottest 7 on record. And we've just found out in the last couple of days that July 2021 was the hottest month ever. Sea levels are going up at an accelerating rate. Oceans are becoming more acidic because they're absorbing both heat and CO2, and that is changing our marine systems and influencing our terrestrial systems. We're losing our glaciers at an enormous rate. This is putting at risk the freshwater resources of 2 billion people in the world. Cyclones are getting more intense. We'll probably get a category 6 before long. The water cycle is intensifying, and that means that dry areas are getting dry. We're getting more severe droughts and more often. The wet areas are getting wetter. And when we do get rain anywhere, it tends to come down in more intense bursts, causing flooding. We're losing our snow, and it will be the case that in 20, 30, 40 years' time, the ski industry in Australia, for example, will be pretty much no more. And we're all being affected, really, most of us, by bushfire seasons lengthening and becoming more severe. They're now about 2 months more longer than they used to be. We're losing our coral reefs. 3 bleaching events in the last 50 years in the Great Barrier Reef have resulted in the loss of about 50% of the coral. We're getting salt water intruding into our freshwater ecosystems, potentially transforming places like Kakadu National Park. And we're getting fires penetrating into ecosystems that have basically never had fires before and are not adapted. They're just some of the ways our biological and physical systems around us are transforming before our eyes. But we also need to make sure that people understand that climate change is not just an environmental problem. It's sometimes often talked about as just an environmental problem, but of course it's a problem for all sectors because all sectors are tied to the environment. Susie, I think, was mentioning issues of social justice. The latest Oxfam report said that 20 million people are displaced by extreme weather now every single year. And you can see from this graph, which is from that report, this is the only graph I think I'm going to show you, how much that has increased even over the last 3 or 4 years. And of course, we know that human populations are disproportionately affected by climate change, with the most severe impacts being felt in remote communities, including Indigenous communities, by the elderly, by the impoverished, and by children. So another key message is that climate change is doing us harm now. It's not just a future problem. What's ahead of us? Well, basically more of the same, more of all of those extreme climatic events that we just talked about, and the IPCC report, which got a gratifying amount of publicity in the last couple of weeks, is all about that. So here's the question that we all get asked a lot. Is there any hope for the future? And whenever I'm asked that question, my response is that we have to regard hope as much a strategy as it is an emotion, that without hope, we give up. And if we give up, well, our demise will come around assuredly. So we must retain hope in order to move forward and act. So yes, but. The thing is, the longer we wait to take serious action, the taller the mountain of emissions grows. The climate is affected by cumulative emissions, not just emissions in a day or in a year. The longer we wait to tackle this, the taller the mountain and the further we've got and the bigger the challenge becomes. So action soon rather than action later, like in 2050 or beyond, is what's really important. And you've all heard of the climate agreement struck in Paris in 2015, aiming to keep temperatures below 2 degrees and preferably below 1.5. Unfortunately, we're not meeting that agreement yet. Pledges thus far to Paris give us about 3 degrees of warming. Given that the world has already warmed 1.2 degrees and we're seeing the Northern Hemisphere, Europe on fire, the Black Summer bushfires, heat waves everywhere, we can only really imagine what a 3-degree world would be like. This graphic actually puts some words on that. 3 degrees, outright chaos. 4 degrees, incompatible with an organised global community. And even 2 degrees is considered scientifically a very dangerous boundary. That should be as much rationale as anybody needs for action. But, in all of the gloom and doom and accelerating climate change that was described so eloquently in the IPCC report, there was one little silver lining. And I think this is the first time that the IPCC has been this explicit. It basically said that under the 4 lower emission scenarios that were used in that report, the slowing down of global surface warming would be detectable after 20 to 30 years. I don't think they've ever said that before. They're basically saying if we get emissions under control very soon, very seriously, within our lifetimes, and certainly within our children's lifetimes, we can at least stabilise the temperature and look forward to a more stable climate. To me, that's a bit of a silver lining. Now, I am going to mention the carbon budget because this is the most powerful rationale for action that you can think about. And I'm going to try and keep it really simple so that you can pass it on really simply to your organisations. The carbon budget basically relies on our scientific understanding that the more carbon we put into the atmosphere, temperatures go up. And those two things are actually linearly related. It's a very strong and well understood relationship. And we can use that carbon budget to ask these really basic questions. Will we meet the 1.5 degree target? There was a lot in the IPCC report about this. So we can take our current emission rates and we can ask the question, when will we have put all that carbon into the atmosphere that get us to 1.5 degrees? And the answer to that is in about 2.5 years. That would require a 5-fold increase in global Paris pledges and meeting them. We can ask the same question for staying well below 2 degrees, and the answer is, based on the algorithm, we'll spend our carbon budget for 2 degrees about by 2030 at the present rate of emissions. That requires a threefold increase in our Paris pledges and their successful implementation. Furthermore, to stay below 2 degrees, the carbon budget tells us we have to globally reduce emissions by about half compared to now by 2030. We actually have to be at net zero by 2040 at the latest, and 2050, which is the target that most countries have set and many businesses, is actually a decade too late. We have waited too long to be satisfied with 2050. But what does net zero actually mean? We talk about net zero all the time, but a lot of people are pretty confused. What is zero? What is net zero? Basically, you can think of net zero as an overall equilibrium, an overall balance between greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere and greenhouse gases being taken out of the atmosphere. Net zero means that those two things balance out. The reason why the net zero target is so important is that we know it's easier to reduce emissions from some sectors than from others. We can electrify energy and transport and manufacturing, power all that from renewables, and that will take those emissions out of the atmosphere. But some other sectors like agriculture is much harder, though moving to a plant-based diet will help. So basically, some sectors will still have to be allowed to emit carbon, but other sectors will have to go negative and draw down more carbon than they emit in order for us to reach net zero. So what do we need to do? Well, there are multiple scales of action. Individual, community, business, subnational, national, international. They're all different and they're all important. We have to do all of them. At the government level, national, state and territories and locals, we have to do things like get rid of fossil fuel subsidies. As I said, electrify everything, transform the grid, stop digging up coal, incentivise electric and active transport. But at the individual level, there's quite a different set of actions: plant-based diets, moving your money out of fossil fuel investment, putting solar panels on your roof, consuming less, joining an action group so that you don't feel alone. These are really important individual actions. So we can think of community organisations as being in the middle of this. Community organisations are influenced by and can influence governments. Similarly, they are influenced by their individual members and can influence those individual members. So I see community organisations as being very firmly embedded in this, multiple scales of action. And I want to make this point. Hypothetically, this is the house of a greenie tree hugger like me. It's not actually my house, but just go with me. If you've got the same house with the same amount of solar panels on the roof that is owned by a right-wing climate change denier who just wants to reduce their electricity bills, what does this tell you? The impact on the atmosphere is the same. Whether you're a greenie tree hugger or a right-wing climate change denier, same amount of solar panels has the same impact. The point I'm trying to make here is that the climate is actually not affected at all by what we think. It's actually affected by what we do. The Climate Council, of which I'm a proud member and a proud founder, has a lot of resources on its website that I would recommend. There is a climate action toolkit. There is a communication guide. This one's fairly old now, but more recently we've got some other things. We have little explainers, things in lay language that set out to explain things that are going on in the world. The latest, which we've called Summaries with Simon, who's our chief researcher, is a little explainer on the latest IPCC report, breaking down that report that's thousands of pages into simple language. So I commend those to you. We also have, very importantly, a whole series of conversation guides. So please use those. And I'm going to very quickly, because I'm sure I'm out of time, just sort of capture some of the key messages from those guides. So please go and have a look at them. We do need to balance the negative with the positive so that people don't lose heart and give up. You know, our kids' future is at stake, but there are great opportunities in a clean, green economy. We need to emphasise that the cost of action is far less than the cost of inaction. We need to emphasise, and I think I caught the end of Rebecca's talk, the energy from renewables is actually now cheaper than the energy from fossil fuels. The more we do now, the easier it will get over time. Some other messages. We can't afford to wait till 2050. It's what we do in the next few years and this decade that really counts. Australia internationally is falling behind. We're a huge cause of the problem as one of the biggest exporters of fossil fuels in the world. We actually have a moral duty to be part of the solution. But we have unrivaled resources to do that, not just our renewable resources, but we have a stable economy, great science, great technology. And finally, no organisation can do everything, but every organisation can do something. Here's the mantra: every fraction of a degree matters, every year matters, and every choice matters. Thank you. I will leave it there and back to Kelly.
Thanks, Leslie. That was very informative, as per usual. And we, just to let everyone know, we will provide links to all the resources that Leslie mentioned in her slide as part of a follow-up email to everybody, and also copies of the presentations as well. So you'll get those. Thanks, Leslie. So I think we now have Susie back with sound. So
can you
Susie,
hear me, Kelly?
We can hear you.
Yeah, I'm using telephone and screen. It's crazy.
Okay, thank you so much.
It's the first time this has happened, so it's great when it happens in the middle of a presentation.
Not your fault at all. And we handled it very well. Thanks for stepping in, Leslie.
Excellent. Thanks,
okay.
Leslie.
All right, so I'll hand back to you. I think we're on the slide about health impacts, just finishing up
all right.
there.
All right, I'll try sharing that now and just, is that, everybody can see that?
Yes.
Excellent, great. Well, look, actually, that's kind of a good interjection, Leslie, to frame the science that sort of sits behind all of these conversations. And I guess where we are situated is in how you try and bring the community services sector together with a whole lot of other organisations to build responses to the challenges that Leslie and Rebecca have already sort of framed so far. So just to finish this particular slide, I think I was trying to kind of talk about the key points that we use to sort of frame our conversations with the community service sector, and a key point about how we adapt to climate change and how we build resilient communities is really needs to be framed and driven by a social justice agenda. And I guess that really echoes a lot of what we hear, and particularly with COVID. It's about not just bouncing back to normal. It's not bouncing back to a status quo, because what we've seen is that the status quo really doesn't work for a whole lot of people, and a whole lot of people are left behind. But really, if we're talking about building resilient communities, we need to do better, and we need to create, develop out of poverty, reduce vulnerability, and build the capabilities of communities to function. So how we then talk about climate change. So we've been working with community service organisations in Melbourne over the last 6 to 12 months, and a key focus that we galvanise conversation around is community resilience. And I just want to sort of talk a bit about why we frame our conversations with CSOs around this concept. Now, when you look up the definition of community resilience, there are an awful lot of definitions. There's not necessarily one neat definition of community resilience. But there are elements that cut across a lot of the practice that we've seen and a lot of the research that goes on to understand what a resilient community constitutes. And when you look at these concepts here, many of them will resonate already with much of the work that we know you're already involved in the community services sector. Building local knowledge, training and education, collective efficacy and empowerment, community networks and relationships, and so on. These are all the themes then that come up in our conversations with community service organizations. So I'm not going to run through these. I'm just putting them there really to sort of say that community resilience offers real opportunities to talk about transformative change. And why we talk about this with the community service sector is, I think there are obvious reasons why, because much of the work that the community service sector does is trying to build resilience in its everyday work. And it's really framing the challenge of climate change and the challenges that climate change and extreme weather events in particular present in the context of already existing work with community service organizations. Really importantly, though, the community services sector, as this ACOSS report will attest to, is that the community services sector is critical in this space. The role that it plays in advocating and fighting for social justice is really critical. And there are not many other sectors whose sole purpose it is to focus on social justice issues. So that's one really important reason why the community services sector needs to be involved in empowering communities to improve resilience. But also, community services sector are well connected to their communities and to organizations and people on the ground. And so they do have a really strong understanding of the meaning of vulnerability and how that changes over time. And this is all really important to the work of adaptation and building resilience. And I guess the other point to make is that the community services sector, while struggling, no doubt, being overburdened with a whole range of other challenges, really is playing an important role in doing a whole lot of community development work already in this space. So the workshops that we've been doing in Melbourne, we've engaged with about 80 community service organisations across a range of local government areas in metropolitan Melbourne and into regional Victoria. And what we're trying to do is have these conversations, build the relationships between, in particular, between each other, between community service organisations working in place, but also between local governments and community service organisations. So this is driven by local governments who've declared a climate emergency, as well as the municipal public health and wellbeing agendas. And what that means is that local governments want to know how they can best support and provide for vulnerable communities. And having a conversation and bringing community services together in that conversation is really critical. And that's the nature of the workshops that we've been doing. What we've also realized is that having these conversations in place is really important, because the knowledge that's held by community service organizations and the participants and clients that they support really is where we develop a rich understanding of what it means to be vulnerable, and also where our strengths and our capacities to respond are. So when you talk about building resilience in a place-based way, these workshops really do start focusing people's minds and attention on the sorts of actions that need to happen in place. So it's about building climate literacy in the workshops, but it's also building a framework to empower action in a place-based and collaborative way. And that's very much the focus of the work that we're doing. One of the things we do talk about is the research that's been done on the community services sector. And we know that there's increasing awareness around climate change impacts. And ACOSS did a survey in 2019 of about 138 different organizations. So 67% had not yet started to develop risk assessments or implemented climate plans, but they are already seeing the impacts of climate change on their staff, on the work that they're on their work across a range of issues, staff absence from work, etc. And we also know, and Rebecca drew attention to some of these barriers. There are particular barriers that we're seeing within the community services sector that really is challenging. Being resourced is a key part of that, being overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, but a lack of information and literacy and a way of talking, which is what this whole workshop is really about. But we're sort of interested in how we're engaging in a language and in a set of issues that the community services sector already understands and already values as important. And that really is about supporting those who are most at risk and most vulnerable. And so it's understanding those risks that's really what these conversations need to be about. And then that leads to a range of actions and strategies based on that understanding. So the workshops, this is just a couple of slides. I'm almost done. I know we're running out of time. But the workshops that we've been engaging in, I think one thing that's really important about them is it brings local governments and different departments within local governments, not just the climate change and sustainability department, but the health and wellbeing teams. Now it's very much their responsibility also to think about climate change. We're bringing local governments, various departments, those who manage assets and infrastructure, those who oversee the management of cool spaces, for example, those who are interested in urban greening strategies. These people are all in this conversation and they're all listening to community service organisations talk about the lived experience of impacts, both in terms of their own services and in terms of the people that they support. And so we use various techniques, simple scenario exercises to map how we understand and are seeing impacts already across different participants. And we have disability services, we have neighbourhood houses, we have a whole lot of different people who work with a whole lot of different participants in the room. So we talk about impacts with as experienced by participants, but also as experienced by organisations themselves and the wider society. So we sort of try and think in a systems-like way when we talk about climate change. This is just a slide that's sort of on the right there, some comments and feedback that we've got. And I think it's about a recognition of the urgency, but in talking about the urgency of these challenges and following up immediately with how we can act together, that's where the sense of empowerment, there is not a sense of leaving a room feeling overwhelmed by the urgency, but you're already in a room talking with a lot of people and you feel a sense of collective efficacy just in engaging with these issues. Because there's certainly what we're seeing is there is a real interest in engaging on these issues from the community service sector, and there's also a real interest from local governments to want to talk about this with the community services sector. And so bridging this relationship and exchanging our understanding of these challenges is something that's been really valuable. And I guess a key point to make here is that the critical services and social infrastructure that local governments and community services provide are at risk during extreme weather events. And this in itself compounds impacts. And so that really does focus people's minds on the importance of their role and the importance of climate planning in this context. And I'll just sort of finally here on the really, I guess, importance of place-based collaborative approaches to empowerment and to talking about climate change. So the need for, oh, I seem to have lost my slides again. I'm having a fantastic technical time here. Kelly, can you see my slides or have they disappeared?
The slides have disappeared, so it's just your desktop.
Great, so you get to see all the chaos on my desktop.
Oh, I was actually thinking how tidy it is compared to mine.
Oh, it's all behind the scenes. Look, you don't need to see this last slide. I think I can just speak to the key points. Really, it's about bringing organisations into a room in a cross-sectoral kind of way. It's also about going beyond the tools. We have a number of different tools for organisations to reflect on their adaptive capacity and reflect on their resilience. And these are really important, and they really do help organisations think about the elements that they need to have in place. Leadership is a key part of it. but it's about actually working collaboratively. A large, I guess, a key message that we've heard in the work that we've been doing with a range of different organizations is it's the relational nature of the work that we have to do. You can hand a tool to an organization, but it's really about working collaboratively and relationally. That's really important. Developing our understanding of risk in place and the strengths of place are really important, and focuses attention on things like housing and infrastructure and network building. And a really important point just to finish on is that we need to deepen our understanding of the lived experience and bring those who are directly impacted by climate change into these conversations to empower change. So I might just wrap up. And I guess the final slide I had was, how do we work differently and how do we work together is really where we need to focus our minds in response to these significant challenges that climate change presents. And I apologise for the disruptions. Thanks, Kelly.
Oh, thanks, Susie. That was a great presentation, despite the interruptions. So you did very well under trying circumstances. So really appreciate it. And your presentation will be available to everyone after this as well.
Yeah.
So thank you. I'll just stop the screen sharing for now. There we go. So we're back to the big group. Okay, we're going to go into about 15 minutes of Q&A. So I'll ask Crystal Chambers from Red Cross, who had a question very early on, to come off mute and ask her question. But while she's looking for her mute button, and hopefully she's still there, just a reminder, if anyone wants to ask a question, either put it in the chat or raise your hand, and you can do that. There's a reactions button down the bottom that has a little raise hand function, and that should allow me to see the hand. And feel free to come on video now so that everyone can see you as well. So Crystal, are you?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Kelly. Sorry, it's noisy where I am. Excellent presentations by all. Thank you all so much. I did write my question when Rebecca was speaking, but it's relevant to everybody. And it's slightly been addressed as well. How do we find the balance of talking about climate in an urgent, relevant and current way, demonstrating that the impacts are already happening without triggering that hopelessness response from the audience?
Thanks, Crystal. Rebecca or Susie or Leslie?
I suppose, again, I go back to my climate compass here. Sorry, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
So,
yep.
Look, any behaviour change requires kind of balancing loss and gain in communication, right? So balancing risks and opportunities, and I suppose light and dark. You have to do it no matter who you're talking to. It's just the quantum varies, and the language can vary, the tone can vary as well. And I see in groups that I do that you kind of see different thresholds of tolerance for what Leslie has presented, which is the really important truth of the scenario, which you don't want to hide from, but you do need to work out when is there a point where that is that needs to be communicated, but then becomes a problem, and then you shift gears to solutions, co-benefits, empowerment, or levers that people can push, relevance. So I've got to say there's not a one size fits all. There's always going to be that balance of loss and gain in any communication. It's just going to vary depending on who you're talking to, what you're asking them to do, I think is really critically important as well. So so it's basically, it's the same recipe, but with different amounts of ingredients in depending on who you're talking to.
And Crystal, I would add to that, you know, the worst way of dealing with the climate crisis is sitting on the couch and shouting at the television. You know, I know it's sort of easy to do, but to me, the way to have hope and to motivate people is to provide them with a handy list of actions that they can do. And, you know, action is what's needed, and action is really empowering. And I mean, as Rebecca says, it depends on who the audience is, and some audiences you've got to judge where that tightrope that I spoke about is best placed, and you're never going to get it right for every audience, for everybody in the audience, because they're always mixed. But I think, you know, if there's one thing that I could emphasize is that just thinking, just being concerned, just getting more information doesn't cut it. It's actually giving people something that they feel they can do. And that works at the community level as well.
Thanks, Leslie. Susie, did you have anything to add?
Look, I agree, and I think on sort of giving people a list of actions on that particular point, and I'm happy to share, we have a sort of ecological justice resources and toolkit, which was really a range of different actions that you can take individually, but also in your household and also as an organisation. So we've developed that for these community service organisation workshops. So I'm happy to share that. But I think it's having conversations, and I guess my particular focus here has been on engaging the community services sector itself. And it's by coming together in a room and not thinking individually as an organisation, because that's when it becomes overwhelming. You think, well, what can we do, and how do I garner interest in my organisation? But it's actually working together that really does. That's the basis of empowerment, and it's the actions that come from that working together. I guess challenges that sense of defeat that you can easily feel if you're sitting on the couch yelling at Craig Kelly, for example.
Thanks. Thanks, Susie. Okay, there's a question from Celia Hung, and then we'll go to Michael Bledsdale and then Ben from VCOSS, probably all we've got time for in terms of questions. So Celia, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Okay, sorry, I thought I already typed it in the chat, but okay, so I have two questions. One is for Rebecca and Leslie, I think. So I heard from some community leaders and climate activists that they think the narrative focusing on carbon is not as effective as if we focus on water, because water is much closer to people's life. Like, you know, everyone, regardless of people's backgrounds, rely on water every day than carbon. And those activists also think that focusing on water protection and preservation will directly help reducing carbon emission as well. So I'm wondering, how do you think about it? I'm not sure if I should ask another question after they answer it, but that's my first question.
I'll answer that in a way that also addresses Ben's question from VCOSS, like around objects of care that come up a lot. And look, water and air, so often we found that talking about pollution rather than carbon can be helpful. It really, again, it depends on what you're talking about, and certainly so we found that kind of can be more effective with harder to reach audiences. And so that kind of idea of kind of clean air, clean water, available water is helpful. And then also the other object of care that comes up a lot is mental and physical health. And I think COVID's increased that to some extent. And I think COVID has also increased the value that people place on the health and the access to green, clean spaces in within urban environments as well, I think. So there's been a range of those kinds of things that have that tend to be kind of almost universally valued, and we've seen an increased value in the last 18 months under COVID as well.
Yeah, look, I would just add, look, once again, it depends on the audience. You know, for some audiences, water is a really powerful message, you know, farming communities, people that have seen, you know, been in water restrictions, etc. Yes, water availability is going to be more powerful than something that's hard to see and feel and envisage. For other communities, you know, the carbon thing, I think for urban communities, and coming back to Rebecca's ideas about pollution, because we don't tend to run out of water in places like Sydney, even though there are restrictions. That can be more powerful. So it's a matter of picking the communities, and ultimately for any form of communications, it's about finding strategies where you focus on what people care about, what they're concerned about, and that will be different in different communities and different parts of the country. So I think it's always a matter of understanding your audience as best you can.
Susie, did you want to add based on JSS's experience?
Yeah, look, I think, and you've sort of put in to the chat as well, Kelly, heat is certainly something that we know people understand. It's tangible, it's experienced, everyone has experienced it in some way. And so when we kind of talk through scenarios, we look at kind of compounding scenarios. So in the middle of a heat wave, there's a power outage and it's also COVID, and that really sharpens the mind around what that means for community service organisations and the experiences of those that they work with, like those with a disability, not being able to access cool spaces, those living in public housing where it's just unbearable, and those who are not able to turn on air conditioning or they don't have it because of the cost. You start to then really unpack the challenges. So I know heat is certainly something that galvanises the mind. And as for the issue of water, I think we've worked with, in my previous role, worked with catchment management authorities and the water sector, and certainly that is very much front and centre in the way that they're approaching climate change. But in this particular case, with CSOs, that's how we're sort of engaging through heat in particular.
Yeah, thanks, Susie. I guess it goes back to Rebecca's initial, and I think both Leslie and Susie, you've echoed this, is making the connection with the communities and what matters to them is then the frame that you use. Michael, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Look, I just need to sort of preface this by the fact I'm coming from the perspective of working with a very local church organization, which is very much committed to climate action and has in fact been very much part of the recent High Court case around challenging the Minister for Environment. So we're very little, very small, and very local, but also really committed towards climate action. And so really interested in the perspectives of everyone here. Leslie, just one point. I hope that you're going to make your presentation available. I was scribbling away the last couple of slides there because everything you were saying was so meaningful, but I didn't get all of it down. But my main question, I think, is directed for Susie. A lot of what you're saying there about bringing all of these people in, making sure that no one is left behind, and I use that term, deliberately, sounds to me very much like the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think you brought that up right at the beginning in the introduction around the fact that we're going to be referencing those. However, everywhere I go in Australia, and I've been involved at the systemic level, for quite a long time, I hear no reference to the SDGs. And indeed, I brought this up with the chief minister in the ACT, the head of the Green Party there, who said that there was no political mileage in the SDGs. I'm just wondering, is there any potential for us trying to provide the SDGs as a framework for the kind of things that we're wanting to do here to bring all of these sectors into line with what the message around climate change? And the other question I had, which is for all of the other panelists, is my perception is that we've got a lot of politicians at the moment at state and federal level who are very lazy. And I'm just wondering how we can actually, all of these linkages that we've kind of put up there on slides, how do we facilitate that? Because my own personal belief is that we need to actually direct our politicians to how they can make these linkages, because they're not going to make it of their own volition. They're just not capable of doing it. So how do we actually bring these politicians into line to make sure that they understand the interconnectivity between climate action and all the other areas that are probably relevant to their portfolios?
Thanks, Michael. Who wants to go first?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, look, I think, Leslie and Rebecca might also have something to add here. Look, I guess on the SDGs, my background and what I've been teaching in my previous role is sustainability. And so we talk about the SDGs all the time in that work. And it's certainly galvanizing some sectors and some organizations, and it is being used, and it's a conversation in the university sector, is how SDGs can actually be embedded across the organization and how you measure it. So I think there is some value, and again, it will be dependent on the organizations that you're engaging with. I would say that the ideas of the intersecting nature of the sustainability and climate change challenge is the way in which we talk about this work with community services. And I guess whether we explicitly put the SDGs up front, not at this stage, and the extent to which I guess it might galvanize community services sector, it might conceptually help think about the intersection for sure. So I'm not suggesting it's not important, or it might not become more of an important framework in future. Just a couple of other things on intersecting issues and how it galvanizes. Livability is something, and I'm an urban planner by background, livability is something that many people can comfortably get their heads around. And it's sort of not controversial, it's not politically controversial. And people also really do understand when they think about the livability of their local area and beyond, or lack of livability in particular parts of the regions and cities we live in. One of the things we've been trying to do is bring climate change into the livability conversation. And so we're working with 2 local governments, helping them develop indicators, if you like, or understand the data of how livability and climate change, and adding climate change projections onto livability is something that they think they need to think about. And this is very much driven by the public health and wellbeing agenda in Victoria that is requiring councils to think about climate change. So that's one. So health, livability and climate change are really useful ways to talk about intersecting issues on a practical level. I guess a couple of other points then is how do you galvanize politicians? There's a lot of talk about evidence-based decision-making, and we know that there's some real problems with that we do a lot of work to bring the evidence to the table, and that doesn't necessarily drive the decision making, but we still need to bring the evidence to the table regardless. And I think it's how you bring that evidence and how you frame it for different audiences is kind of what we're talking about here today. But there's a lack of evidence, particularly around the health impacts of climate change and heat. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on how you define vulnerability, and Department of Health and at state level and at local level are grappling with that challenge right now. And just finally, the voices then. It's the voices of those living in and with climate change that does capture, I guess, the emotion, but also just the real lived experience. And it does shine a light on the injustices that we have in society, and that the way we're building housing to such poor quality, the lack of work we're putting into public housing and social housing, all of these issues, people get that, they understand that. And ACOSS have actually produced a great video with their work on feeling the heat that I commend to people. So you might look at their website, that really does resonate. I don't know if that answers all your questions, Michael, but it's, yeah.
No, it's very helpful. Thanks. I appreciate it. And I might get in contact with you privately on some issues. That's great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Susie. Okay, I'm just really conscious of time. We did want to spend a little bit of time in breakouts just so people can talk a little bit about what we've heard today and what frames and narratives could work well in your organisations. And what would work well for external communications. So I think we've heard a lot about communicating internally, but let's also touch on external and what additional resources you might need. So we were going to do a little activity, but I'm just, because we're running about 15 minutes over, I think we might skip the activity and that we just spend 15 minutes now in the breakout group talking about that first question. How could you apply these communications and frames in your workplace? So to facilitate the breakouts, will go into probably 6 groups of about 5 people. So Rebecca and Leslie and Susie have kindly agreed to facilitate a breakout each. I'll do one, and Anastasia, my colleague who's been working madly behind the scenes with the technology, will facilitate one as well. Hi, Anastasia. And Ben from ACOSS, who you heard Susie mention ACOSS before and the great work they've done, is also going to facilitate a little breakout group. So Anastasia's going to whiz us away into the breakout groups now for 15 minutes.